Thank you for coming today, and thanks to those of you who are watching online. So we're going to talk and hear a little bit of Mozart today, or maybe not. Mozart, like all famous composers, and we have to remember that he was well known during his lifetime and especially after his death, although unfortunately for him it didn't always translate into financial success. But after his death, his fame grew, actually. And of course, he's one of the most well-known and revered composers today. But interesting things happen when you pass away and you're a famous public musician. And among other things that happened to people like Mozart was that in the years after his death, publishers started bringing out music that they claimed to be by Mozart. And some of it was, and some of it wasn't. And some of it was maybe partly by Mozart. So this is a little program of 6 pieces that fall into all 3 categories. And I'll play each one, and then I invite you, while you're hearing it, to listen to it and decide for yourself whether it might or might not be by Mozart. And then we'll talk a little bit about each piece. Even if they're not by Mozart, actually most of them have very interesting little histories. So the first one is called Waltz, or Valse in French, and in some editions it's called Arietta. This piece probably has the least to do with Mozart of any of the ones that I'm playing today. It's been traced back to, of all things, a method book published by the Paris Conservatory in the early 1800s, about 1804, which is actually only a little more than a decade after Mozart's death. It's actually hard to see why it was attributed to Mozart. The book is full of little pieces like this. A lot of them have no composer listed and were probably composed by the staff of the Paris Conservatory. Some of them are actual melodies, at least, by real composers, and there are even some actual authentic pieces by Mozart. And if you have played the piano at all and know anything about Mozart, especially when he was young, he produced hundreds, literally, of rather easy pieces that still populate our method book collections today. This piece has gained probably an undeserved continued existence because it was picked up by other easy children's music anthologies in the 19th century, and from there it made its way into the Suzuki piano method, Book 2, where it's still listed as by being W.A. Mozart. And so it will probably be continue to be attributed to Mozart for the foreseeable future. In this, I see kind of a peculiar anthology to the way fake news spreads on social media today. Okay, the next piece is entitled Romance. What do you think, yes or no? It's a very convincing rendition of what another composer thinks is a piece by Mozart. But this piece, which is titled Romance, which is actually the title itself is kind of a giveaway because he never wrote another solo piano piece with that title. He actually used the title, but it's only in his instrumental and orchestral works. And there's no way you can see this from where you are, but the piece is in the key of A flat major, which is again a key he never used in any of his other solo piano works. It does have some claim to authenticity in that it was brought out by a publisher named Andre, who actually brought out a lot of Mozart's works during his lifetime and immediately afterwards. But this piece first appeared in print in 1851, in other words, 60 years after Mozart passed away. And I don't know whether you read the news these days, but there actually have been new works by Mozart that have been previously undiscovered, brought to light in the past couple of years. And there's been great excitement in the musical world, and you see like scans of the manuscripts, you know, and handwriting experts authenticate the handwriting as by Mozart. Well, back in 1851, when this piece came out, there was none of that. You know, it was just published as being by Mozart. Musicology was not the advanced science it was today, and so it was accepted for a long time as being by Mozart, but there's actually no evidence that it's by Mozart. It's a nice piece, though, I think. Okay, it actually gets more interesting now. So this is an Allegro in G minor. What do you think? Yes. Well, yes and no. So I'm going to have to digress and tell you a little bit about Mozart's wife and later widow, Constanze. Uh, in popular culture, she's not portrayed in a very flattering way. If you've ever seen the classic film Amadeus, she's actually portrayed as kind of a twit. But she actually was a lot smarter and a more astute business person than she's given credit for in history, particularly in the wake of Mozart's death, and it was pretty clear that he was not in a good financial state. One of the things she did was she entered into a contract with the aforementioned publishing house, Andre, to publish whatever remained of Mozart's works that he hadn't gotten around to publishing. But in order to maximize her income, she had a lot of manuscripts that he had left in an unfinished state completed by friends and colleagues of Mozart. And the most famous of these actually is the Requiem that he wrote, which was completed by a man named Franz Süssmayr. This movement, which was probably intended as the first movement of a multi-movement sonata, which likewise was never composed, was about half composed by Mozart, the first half. Again, if you know anything about music theory and composition, if you have half of a sonata movement, it's actually not that hard to figure out how the rest should go, because sonata movements of that period always return to the beginning as their last third. And so this piece is in Mozart's hand about halfway through, and we don't know the person who completed it, but since he had all of Mozart's themes and an idea of how the piece was going to go, it probably wasn't that difficult for him to complete it. And as you can see, it's not an unconvincing rendition. Probably if Mozart had worked further with it, he might have come up with something a little bit more substantial to round out the piece. For me, it does end kind of abruptly, but there's nothing you can say negatively about it, and I think it's a convincing work and probably deserves to be played more often. Okay. Is number 4 the minuet? Okay. Definitely by Mozart, yeah. But if you were wondering if it was, I can understand. It has some very strange harmonies in it. I don't know whether you noticed or not. And as if to kind of outline them in the score, he marks each of those dissonant chords forte. You know, so it seemed like he was experimenting a little bit. And although the piece is complete as it stands, if you know anything about classical period and dance forms like minuets, they always had a central section, and then you played this first section again. There's no trace of this central section, what's called a trio, in this piece. So it's most likely unfinished. If he had trouble figuring out what was going to come after that, I think I would agree. Okay, this next piece is probably the most familiar of the set that I'm playing today, but even so, it's not without its interesting historical issues. So this piece is authentically by Mozart, except for the last 10 measures. Now, why is that? First of all, I'll play you where the first edition ends. In other words, it was actually published without the last 10 measures, and it sounds like this. Well, it became pretty obvious that something was missing. What that something is has been a matter of controversy ever since. This is a piece entitled Fantasy, and just around the same time period when he was being heavily influenced by his discovery of the music of J.S. Bach and Baroque music in general, he had actually composed a piece which he entitled Fantasy and Fugue. So some of the thinking goes that maybe he intended to also write a fugue to follow this fantasy, but there's no trace of one. Another theory just holds that he never finished the piece, and it certainly can't be performed the way it appeared in the first edition. And so in the second edition, a musician named August Eberhard Müller just added those last 10 bars so that there would be a nice, definitive, splashy conclusion. So this piece is almost completely by Mozart. Okay, and then our final piece, this titled Jig. And there is a story concerning this piece. Mozart was aware in the last few years of his life that although he lived in Vienna, for 10 years and had enjoyed some success, in the late 1780s, things were really not going well for him. And so he actually made a number of concert tours trying to see if he could get a better job somewhere else. He was actually trying to make it as a freelance musician in Vienna, and we all know that that's a risky profession. So in 1789 and 90, he took a tour to several places in Germany, and among them Leipzig, which is where, if you know your music history, that's where Johann Sebastian Bach spent the last 2.5 decades of his life. He visited St. Thomas's Church, where Bach had been the organist and the choir master. He played on the organ that Bach had played on. It must have been actually quite experience for him. And to thank his German hosts for their hospitality, he actually composed this little jig on the spot and copied it into the notebook of one of the St. Thomas organists. So of all the pieces today, this is the sole piece that's completely, absolutely by Mozart, no question. But again, because he was in Bach's milieu and was probably steeped in the memory and the style of Bach, he actually wrote a little piece in the style of Bach. This is the only piece that he wrote that's titled Jig, and it's written in a two-part form, exactly the way Bach used to compose his dance suites for keyboard. So I hope you've enjoyed this little, I guess you could call it a musical quiz, but it tells you our great composers' lives are a lot more, I don't know. We think we know what pieces someone composed and whether they're available or not, but the truth is, especially with famous and prolific composers, there's a lot more gray area than you might think. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening.